Okay, so now God is angry with the Israelite assembly because they're now afraid and they're not going to take possession of the land. So he is about to punish them. Then Moses appeals to God's mercy. Then in verse 19, Moses says to the Lord, he says, in accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of these people. And that's very, very important. God sees doubt as a sin. It grieves his heart. So Moses tells the Lord, he says, in accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of these people. Just as you have pardoned them from the time they left Egypt until now. Verse 20, the Lord replied, I have forgiven them as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, listen to this, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it, but because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him to the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. So the Israelite assembly paid a very, very heavy price for doubting God, for allowing fear to take over their hearts and their minds, and for rebelling against the instructions of God. The important lesson here is that our focus either creates fear or faith, not both. And the very, very important thing that we must learn from this is that fear can lead us to doubt God. It can lead us to disobey God. It can lead us to rebel against God. And God views this extremely seriously. As we read in this account here, that assembly never made it to the promised land. Hundreds of thousands of Israelites got old and died without actually making it in the promised land. And only one man, Caleb and Joshua and the descendants of that generation, made it. We see the same thing again and again and again. With Noah, we spoke about last week. God is looking for a remnant, a people that will trust him. And God will not reconsider taking a man out of millions, a man out of billions, a few people out of billions, if they are the ones who follow him wholeheartedly. That is what the Lord is looking for. By focusing on the power and the size of their enemies, we see that the children of Israel saw themselves as grasshoppers. And because of that, they lacked the courage to go ahead as God had instructed them. Because of their lack of faith in God, what happened? They could not follow God wholeheartedly. And we see that same word in Numbers and in Deuteronomy, following God wholeheartedly. But because of their lack of faith and their fear, the children of Israel could not follow God wholeheartedly. And because they doubted the power of God, the greatness of God, the faithfulness of God, they forgot all the miracles that God had done for them in Egypt, in the Red Sea, how God had delivered them from slavery. They had forgotten all about that. They doubted the power of God and the faithfulness of God. What happens is that they were effectively turning their backs to God. And that is what grieved the Lord. And the important lesson here for us is that as long as our fears, our situations, our giants is our focus, then what we are doing in that moment is that we are turning our backs to the power of God, the promises of God, and the faithfulness of God to his children. God, he has promised his children that he will never leave us nor forsake us. So here's a very simple illustration. Here is God, here's our challenges. If our focus is here, our problems, our challenges, our giants, we are effectively turning our backs to the promises of God, the faithfulness of God, and the power of God. And what happens is that anxiety and worry take over and not faith. Well, you see, instead, as the children of Israel focused on the power of God and the faithfulness of God, what would have happened is that it is their enemies that would have seemed like grasshoppers to God. had they focused on and remembered all that God had done for them in Egypt, in the wilderness, how God had provided for them in the wilderness, how God was literally a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day to lead them in the desert, how God had literally sent manna from heaven to feed them, had God had literally parted the Red Sea for them to walk through, they would not have been filled with fear but faith. And if they were filled with faith and they remembered the goodness and the power of God, it is the giants that would have seemed like grasshoppers in the presence of God. And we see a very great example of this in the story of David. What did David, a mere boy, what did he say when he had to face Goliath, who was a giant as well? The entire Israelite army was afraid of Goliath, a giant. But what did David, a mere boy, a little boy, what did he say to Goliath? What did David say to Goliath? So the entire Israelite army was afraid of Goliath, this huge giant. He had armor on, he had spears, he carried a sword, and the whole army was afraid of Goliath. But what did David, a little boy, say when he approached Goliath? Let's read 1 Samuel 17, 32 to 37. It says, David said to Saul, that's King Saul at the time, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Goliath was a Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. He carries